Good morning, friends. Thank you for being here for our Quaker Heritage Day 2017 at Berkeley Friends Church. I'm Brian Young. I know most of you, but for those of you who don't know me or whom I don't know, greetings. I wanted to just make sure that everyone knew a few logistical things about our facility and the day today. That's all I need to say at this point. We're going to have some time to settle back into worship, or to begin worship for those that haven't had that opportunity yet this morning, and we'll ask Marcel to speak whenever she is ready.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to be here with you on such a beautiful day. I am Marcel Martin. I'm a member of Swarthmore Meeting in Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to study early friends and come to this some understanding of their spiritual journey that I want to share with you this morning. I came to Quakerism because I'd had some really powerful experiences, spiritual experiences. I needed a community that could understand those experiences and support me in that. I searched around for community. When I finally found Quakers, it seemed like I had come home because I had actually gone to Swarthmore College and attended my first Quaker meetings on that campus as a college student. And when I first came to Quakers, people kept talking about early friends and how there was so much spiritual power at the beginning of the Quaker movement, and what a pity it was that we didn't have the same spiritual power in our time. So I wanted to learn more about these early friends, and I found the Journal of George Fox rather accessible, having been an English literature major and hadn't read too many 17th century things, but a lot of 18th and 19th century. And especially the first chapter and a half of George Fox I found particularly intriguing, because that's the beginning of his spiritual journey. The rest is much more a travel log. But I found it almost impossible to read the other writers. They were speaking, their language was hard to understand, and what they were talking about and how they were talking seemed really mysterious to me. And it was only when I took a Pendle Hill workshop co-led by two women. One was a literary scholar and the other was a Bible scholar, Georgia Fuller and Michelle Tarter, who sort of opened up for me an understanding of what the times were like, what early friends were writing about, why they chose the style they did, what they were saying. And once I sort of had that doorway into it, then I was able to read their writing on my own. And I began especially to read about the women, the early Quaker women, because I had read a lot. There's a lot of writing out about men who had powerful spiritual experiences. And there is some writing about women who've had powerful mystical experiences, and in most centuries, such women were sent to convents. And I wanted to find out about the women who God had sent out into the world. And I discovered among Quakers that there were some of those women. I had to sort of search to learn about some of them. And I started to write about it. But of course, you can't write about just the women. I mean, one of the phenomenal things about the early Quaker movement is not just that there wasn't a single charismatic leader. There were many charismatic spirit-led leaders. It was a network of both women and men and women together. And that's one of the reasons why it endured when so many of the other denominations of the time fell by the wayside, because you could put half of the Quaker leaders in prison, or even 3/4 of them, and the Spirit would still move through others who were in prison and continue. So I was really inspired by their stories, and I wanted to understand what was their spiritual experience that enabled them to do such bold and courageous and prophetic things. And so I looked more carefully at that writing to understand what that spiritual experience was, and then I tried to teach about it and teach it in a way that would help us in our time understand our own spiritual experience, understand what God is doing in our lives. And that's when the 10 elements were given to me as I looked at that. And that became the basis of the book that Charles Martin has published, Our Life is Love, The Quaker Spiritual Journey. It's based on these 10 elements of the Quaker Spiritual Journey. Last year, for the year-end retreat, I had 4 or 5 days at Quaker Center with a wonderful group of people, and we had sort of the leisure time to look at each of these 10 elements. Today we don't have the time to sort of savor each of the elements. So we're going to sort of race through the elements. Instead, we're going to focus more on 3 movements. And the movement for this session is called the Turning to Christ Within. And we'll look at the first 3 elements. This sheet of paper that you have is just for the morning session. It's got a bunch of quotes on it and some reflection questions. And I would ask you not to be reading it when I'm talking, except when I'm reading out loud these quotes. And then you might find it easier to follow the quotes if you read them on the handout. So, the early Quaker spiritual journey, in the accounts that I read over and over again, it began with longing. It began with this intense longing to know God more intimately. This time in mid-17th century England, where it began, there was a little more religious freedom than there had been. There was also, the Bible had been published in English about 100 years before, and much more recently had been published in an edition small enough that families could purchase it and have a copy in their own home and read it every day. And people were reading it, and they were looking at, well, some of the things we do in church, like the rules that we're supposed to kneel at this particular time, the priest is supposed to wear this certain thing. Where does it say in the Bible that we're supposed to do that? And they began to sort of different groups began to want to purify the church of things that had not been prescribed in the Bible. And there were different ideas about this. Some people were more radical than others. There were the Church of England, for instance, got rid of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, as the chief authority. The Presbyterians got rid of the authority of the bishops. The Congregationalists, who were called independents at the time in England, wanted to have the authority in the congregation. The Anabaptists or Baptists wanted only to baptize mature believers, not infants. So one group after another was more and more radical and purified the church of more of that. But there were all these ideas, and people were debating about them, and an opportunity to try different ways. But the people who became the first Quakers, they started with this intense longing to know God and to know, how does God want us to worship? How does God want us to live? The Calvinist theology predominated in that time, which was the belief that God had already decided before you were born whether you were going to go to heaven or hell. And there was nothing you could do about it. But you could sort of examine your life for signs of which group you were in. And so there was a lot of anxiety about it, a lot of preaching about the sinful nature of humanity, a lot of preaching about human beings didn't deserve to go to heaven, and only by being chosen among the elect did you benefit from the saving grace and get to go. So there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear and a lot of a sense of being burdened by sinfulness. Even children were burdened by this. They also believed that God and Christ were in a heaven far away, not close. And so people felt this distance and this separation. And those who became the first Quakers had a longing to find a closeness to God, to Christ, to know how God wanted them to live, to be relieved of sin, to learn how to overcome sin. I mean, they felt they would make efforts, they had ideas about what was sinful and what wasn't, and they'd make efforts, but they'd find themselves failing and just being burdened by this. So one of the things that I learned as I read the stories of early friends is that they came from all social classes. And as I got to know them, I got to know their stories, and they became sort of friends and mentors and guides to me. And the first one that I have a quote from is Mary Pennington. Mary Pennington was from the wealthiest class in England. England was very stratified by class. some very, very rich people and lots of very poor people, and lots of social manners and social norms that maintain those classes. Anyway, Mary Pennington was in the wealthy class, but she from childhood had this longing to know God. And this is a quote from her autobiography or her spiritual journal. "Oh, the groans and cries in secret that were raised in me, that I might be visited of the Lord and come to the knowledge of his way. I would cry out, I care not for an inheritance in this life. Give it to those who care for it. I am miserable with it. It is acceptance with thee I desire, and that alone can satisfy me. I was like the parched heath, so great was my thirst after that which I did not believe was near me." By the way, I recommend her journal. It's really short and it's very personal, unlike a lot of the early Quaker journals. And so if you want to start with one, that's what I would recommend. So she was longing to be accepted, to know God's way. Stephen Crisp was another early friend who became a very gifted traveling minister. He lived longer than most of the early friends, and so his ministry lasted quite a while. And this is a quote about his spiritual longing too, and you'll see it has a slightly different cast to it. His longing is a little bit different. "I wanted power to answer the requirings of that in me, which witnesseth against evil in me. And this I lamented day and night. And when I was about 19 years old, I sought the power of God with great diligence and earnestness, with strong cries and tears. And if I had had the whole world, I would have given it to have known how to obtain power over my corruptions." So he was longing for this power over his corruptions, or that is, a power to stop sinning, for what he felt was sinful. So even as a boy, he was burdened by this sense of sinfulness and this great longing to be given the spiritual power not to sin anymore. I just have a little quote from George Fox here. I bet he's familiar to most people. But some people didn't feel their longing directly as a longing. Sometimes what they felt instead was, or sometimes what we feel instead, more than our longing, is a sense of the difference between the world that, as it could be, the world sort of based on justice and love and truth and peace, the way the world it could be and the way it is. And sometimes that the disparity between those cause some cynicism or despair, and we wouldn't necessarily identify that as a longing, but in a sense, in a deeper level, there's a longing to live in a different kind of world. George Fox had definitely had strong longings to know God, but there was also that experience that sort of set him off wandering when he was in a pub with his two cousins or relatives who were, like him, professed Christians, and yet they wanted to make a bet on drinking, and whoever drank the least had to pay for everybody's drinks. And he just thought this wasn't the sort of thing that Christians would do. In his journal he wrote, "I was grieved that any that made profession of religion should offer to do so. I was sensible they did not possess what they professed." So that sent him off searching for someone who did possess what they professed. Sent him off visiting all of the noted priests and ministers of his time. And that's the next element, seeking. But before we get there, I wanted to take a little bit of time to invite everyone to think about what is your own experience of longing. Is it something you're in touch with now, or was there a time in your life when you really felt a longing to know God or Christ, or sort of the way to a deeper, truer, more authentic life? Or do you feel now that sense of cynicism or despair because things are not what they could be? Just give you a few minutes to think about it, and then I'll give you a chance to share about that with another person. invite you to turn to someone sitting next to you, and preferably not someone you live with or are married to. I mean, that's okay, but you may have already talked about these things with that person. So find a partner, sit next to that partner. Is there anybody who needs a partner? Is there anybody who doesn't have a partner who needs one? So what I'd like you to do, I see you've already started talking, is I'll take 4 minutes. So each person has 4 minutes to share with the others something about your experience of longing or not longing. And the listener's job is just to listen, not to make a commentary on it, just to listen. If the person runs out of something to say, you just wait expectantly. And into that silence, you actually might find something more to say. And then after 4 minutes, I didn't bring it back, so I'm going to use the timer on my phone. We'll switch, and the other person has a chance to speak for 4 minutes. Next 4 minutes, time for the second person to share. Next 4 minutes, so finish your sentence. There's a friend just came in, there's a blue sheet right on the table at the floor. And I noticed that there was a group of 3. So we're going to, later on in this morning session, we're going to talk again to our same partner. So will someone from that group of 3 be a partner for the man who just walked in? So I want you to hold on, if you can, to that sense of longing, or that memory of longing, or the memory of the disparity between what is and what can be. We'll go back to it. I just want to breeze through seeking, the element of seeking. I think that's something that's really pretty familiar in our time. As I said, in the mid-17th century England, there were a lot of new denominations, each of them proclaiming that they had found the right way to follow Christ. And many of those who became first friends tried out several of those denominations and tried out the practices that they recommended and read the devotional books that each of these groups recommended. And sometimes they stayed with these groups for a while, but then didn't find what they were seeking and then went and tried a different one. Francis Howgill was living in the north of England. He was a farmer, but he from early sort of teenage years had become a seeker. He was really looking for things. And this is a description of his search among the different denominations and practices. I fasted and prayed and walked mournfully in sorrow, and thought none was like me, tempted on every hand. So I ran to this man and the other, and they made promises to me, but it was only words. Then there appeared more beauty in them called independence, and I loved them and so joined them. And I purchased books with all the money that I could get, and walked with them, and owned them as more separate from the world. But at last I saw it was but in words. So when he says, I ran to this man and the other, he means ministers, people who were saying that they had found the way. And in those days, Sunday worship services often all morning, then you go home for lunch and you come back for all afternoon, and then there was Wednesday, usually it was Wednesday lecture night, so you go on Wednesday night and the lectures could be 3 hours. So there was a lot of preaching going on. The next one, William Dewsbury, who was a really important leader of the early Quaker movement. He was about 10 years older than George Fox, something like that, and a mature man when George Fox sort of brought his news to the north of England. William Dewsbury came from Yorkshire. But as a teenager, when it was time for his parents to apprentice him, he begged them to apprentice him to someone in the town of Leeds, because he heard that there were more strict Puritans in that town. And So he became an apprentice as a weaver, and in his free time, which wasn't very much, he went to, he had Sundays off and lecture night, and he went and heard all the lectures. He took them down in shorthand, he studied them, and then he went to visit the ministers to ask them about their sermons and their lectures, and to ask them questions. And this is what he wrote about that. I met with none who could tell me what God had done for their souls in redeeming them from the body of sin, which I groaned under, and which separated me from the presence of God. Although I walked strictly with them in their outward observances, and in running to hear one man after another called ministers, yet I found no rest nor peace to my weary soul. Joan Wilkins was someone who traveled a lot in the ministry, and she wrote also about this short little thing, is book about her longing and her seeking. I did believe that there was a people or church over whom Christ Jesus was head, though I could not yet find them, yet long sought after it sorrowfully, with many strong and fervent cries and desires. Because seeking is familiar, I believe, to most of us, I'm not going to stop and share about that, because I really want to talk more about the third element of the Quaker spiritual journey, which is really key and which made the people who became the first friends different from the others of their time, and called it turning within. So here we have these people, and they're all over England at this time with a lot more new spiritual ideas, people searching for what is the right way to worship, and trying out these new denominations, trying out various spiritual practices, including fasting and singing psalms, and very strict observance of the Sabbath, like no sports and no card playing and no parties on the Sabbath, and things like that. But those who became the first Quakers finally gave up on their seeking. They came to a sense that what they were looking for, they hadn't found in any of the new denominations that they tried out, the very first ones. William Dewsbury, the one who had asked to be apprenticed in the town of Leeds, became a soldier in Parliament's army because there was the Civil War at that time. It was fought for not only political reasons, but religious reasons. The King of England was married to a Catholic woman, and people were really afraid that he was going to turn England back to Catholicism. The country had been going back and forth for 100 years. And the Puritans were gaining power. They had control of Parliament. They raised an army and started a civil war. And William Dewsbury was one of the soldiers in that civil war, ready to fight for what they believed was the coming of Christ. They wanted to create a godly society into which Christ would come, his second coming would come and rule. And so as a soldier, he carried a sword by his side, and he heard while he was in the army that in Scotland, the Presbyterians were much more zealous than the people where he was, and so he walked to Scotland to meet with them. And again, he was disappointed. So finally, this is what he wrote. Finally, I was turned within by the power of the Lord to wait in his counsel, to lighten my conscience, to hear what the Lord would say. So many of them stopped going to church. And after they couldn't find what they were seeking, they stopped going to church. They were waiting for God to act. They've been looking outside of themselves. They've been going to lectures. They've been listening to sermons. They've been going to visit the most noted preachers and priests. They've been reading books. They've been trying all these practices. They hadn't found what they were seeking, and they sort of gave up. A lot of them stayed at home instead of going to church. They waited for God to act, and they looked within. They looked within. They turned within, listening for some action. Here's George Fox. George Fox, in his seeking, spent time in London. His uncle was a Baptist, so he spent a lot of time with the Baptists in London. And then he sort of followed the army to hear all these radical preachers in the army. And he too eventually came to the place of giving up, hoping that someone else would show him the way to God and to Christ. He wrote in his journal, I fasted much and walked abroad in solitary places many days, and often took my Bible and went and sat in hollow trees and lonesome places till night came on. And frequently in the night walked mournfully about by myself, for I was a man of sorrows in the times of the first workings of the Lord in me. I kept myself much as a stranger, seeking heavenly wisdom and getting knowledge from the Lord, and was brought off from outward things to rely wholly on the Lord alone. And though my exercises and troubles were very great, yet were they not so continual, but that I had some intermissions, and was sometimes brought into such a heavenly joy that I thought I had been in Abraham's bosom. He was given up on other people, and he's just turning to God into that direct experience. Mary Pennington, we already saw as that wealthy young woman who'd been trying out these different Puritan churches. Her husband was also a soldier in Parliament's army. In fact, he gave most of his fortune to it, and he died in the war. So here she was, a widow. Her little baby boy died, and she gave up on the churches also. Not having found what I sought after and longed for in the practice of religious duties, in this restless, distressed state, I often retired to the country without any company but my daughter and her maid. And there I spent many hours each day bemoaning myself and desiring the knowledge of the truth. So many friends came to that place, and others who others didn't come to that place, but they were still seeking when they heard the first Quakers bringing the message. And part of that message of the first Quakers was you need to turn within. You need to stop looking outward. You need to turn within. And Francis Haugo, he was that. We read about his seeking. He was a seeker preacher in the north of England. In fact, on the day that George Fox preached on Furbank Fell, there was a whole crowd, maybe 1,000 people who came to hear the seeker preachers in the morning. And Francis Haugo was one of those preachers. They'd sort of given up on, they weren't part of any denomination, they'd sort of given up, and they were waiting for God to send them a prophetic person to show them the way to worship. And they had this kind of, some of them in some of their groups had a way of worshiping, which was sitting in silence until some of them was moved to stand up and speak or preach or give a message. And in fact, their way of worship became the way of worship of the early Friends. But they were still waiting at this point. But Francis Haugo preached on that morning, and then he was there when George Fox got up on a rock and Furbank Fell and preached in the afternoon, and he was like, Fox said, Christ is within you. And Francis Haugo realized that he'd been preaching from his mind the whole time. And he felt convicted and went through a powerful experience, and after which he felt the call to become a Quaker preacher and traveling minister. But he described the early meetings for worship of the first Quakers, powerful gatherings, from a quote that may be familiar to a lot of you. And I'm just quoted the beginning of it because it talks about what they did at the beginning of each of these gatherings, each of these meetings for worship, the process of turning within that happened each time. As we waited upon him in pure silence, our minds out of all things, his heavenly presence appeared in our assemblies when there was no language, tongue, nor speech from any creature. The kingdom of heaven did gather us and catch us all as in a net, and his heavenly power at one time drew many hundreds to land. We came to know a place to stand in and what to wait in, and the Lord appeared daily to us. They began to have these powerful experiences of the presence of God, the presence of Christ within them and among them. But here, it's like in this passage, it gives a little bit of a clue about how they opened up to that experience. He says, there was no language, tongue, nor speech from any creature. That means nobody was speaking. It was an outward silence. And And in some other places it said that outward silence could last an hour or 2 hours, it could be a long time. But he also says, we came to know a place to stand in and what to wait in. It's like there was something they learned, and they didn't give us real specific instructions about that. And I was talking to Doug Wynn about this, and he said that phrase he'd seen in other places too. We came to know a place to stand in and what to wait in. It's like they were giving instructions, but it's instructions about a practice and not about an idea. But here it is. We waited upon him in pure silence, our minds out of all things. So it's not just an outward silence, it's an inward silence. Our minds out of all things. They're not thinking about God, they're not thinking about what they have to do, they're not berating themselves for being sinners, they're just being quiet outwardly and inwardly. It's wonderful to see so many people. Isaac Pennington, his writing has been really helpful to me in understanding early friends. He was one of the most highly educated intellectuals, as well as an upper class person who joined the Quaker movement. He had gone to seminary, I'm always forgetting whether it was Oxford or Cambridge. He had a great spiritual curiosity. He read out all the denominations of his time, and he wrote a tract and sometimes a book about each one. He was a minister of an independent congregation in London for 10 years. But eventually, like the others, he came to a place of really saying, I haven't found that intimacy with God that I was seeking. At a time of despair, at the end of the Civil War, people had great expectations that the Civil War would change society and sort of create a more godly society, and they were disappointed in that. And in that time of disappointment, there was also the disappointment that they hadn't found that intimacy with God they were seeking. We'll talk more about the Penningtons and how they became Quakers. But after he became a Quaker, he wrote some beautiful things about it, and some instructions about how to find that experience of God, which Quakers found, about how to turn within. He wrote, that which God sows and brings up is a sensible plant. Let me say that the word sensible in their time meant sensing, something that senses, that feels. All right, so that which God sows and brings up is a sensible plant, not a knowing mind. And thy right judgment is only in the sensibleness of that plant, not in the understanding or comprehension of thy mind. That's hard instruction for most of us, because I don't know about you, but I like to be in control in my mind, to know what's happening, and to sort of direct my life from my mind. And he's saying that's not the way to turn within and find the living presence of Christ, of the light of God within you. Now, of course, he used his mind to great effect in writing his books about how to do this. It's not that he's saying the mind is not important or valuable, but it's like what is first? What is primary? And he says, in his experience, that turning within is about turning to that sensitive spiritual senses. In another place, he talks about having spiritual eyes that open, spiritual ears that open. It's like spiritual senses that open up to sense something that your mind can't know. Your mind can, after you have the experience, can describe it in certain ways, but it's really through that turning within and turning to those inner senses. And here are some directions that he gave in an essay called, I think it's called Directions to a Panting Soul, that are pretty well known and often quoted among friends, at least in many circles where I have been. Usually in quoting this, the sentence that comes just before this passage is left out. But I like it. I think it's important. Be no more than God hath made thee. Give over thine own willing. Give over thine own running. Give over thine own desiring to know or to be anything. And sink down to the seed which God sows in the heart. And let that grow in thee, and be in thee, and breathe in thee, and act in thee. And thou shalt find by sweet experience that the Lord knows that, and loves, and owns that, and will lead it to the inheritance of life. The seed was a metaphor that was really meaningful to a lot of early friends. Many of them weren't farmers, so they had direct experiences of seeds and what seeds needed. But really, this metaphor really spoke to Isaac Pennington. He sort of studied and talked with Quakers for years before sort of having the experience that made him a Quaker. And when he did, the metaphor of the seed was very important to him. I personally don't resonate with that metaphor so well. Maybe some of you do and some of you don't. But there are other parts of this passage that really do speak to me. So be no more than God hath made thee. It's like, oh, I realize I have so many efforts to make myself going on. To present an image, to try to be what people expect, to try to accomplish things. And so for these instructions for turning within, it's like I can give all of that up right now. And I don't have to make myself. God is making me. God has made me. God has made me something that is still somewhat a mystery to me, and I can just let go and try to find out what that is. Experience that. Give over thine own willing, give over thine own running. Yes, I'm like willfully trying to make things happen. And they may be things that I think God wants, but if I notice, yeah, this is my will. And right now, as I'm turning within, I'm giving that up. Giving up my own running, my own busyness, letting go of that. And even more than that, give over thine own desiring to know or be anything. That's pretty radical. All right, I'm not going to, for this moment, I don't need to know anything. I don't need to be anything. I'm not creating myself. I don't have to try to make myself, as I already said. That's another way of saying it. And then he says, sink down to the seed which God sows in the heart. And one of the things I hear in that is we're so much in our heads and our thinking, and a lot of the control we have in our lives has to do, as I said, with our heads and our thinking, our willing, and our running. We say, move to another place, move to your heart. And in your heart you'll find the seed that God sows, or something of God, something of the light of Christ, the light of Christ in your heart. And let that grow in thee, and be in thee, and breathe in thee, and act in thee. And thou shalt find by sweet experience that the Lord knows that, and loves, and owns that. You saw Mary Pennington was like desperate to be owned by God, to be accepted by God. And he said there's something within us that God does own and love and know. And that is going to lead us to the inheritance of life, which is better than any other kind of inheritance. Inheritance of eternal life. So I'm just going to take a few minutes of silence, and you can try out those instructions for yourself. Thank you. Now we're going to have an opportunity to share with our partner from the place in the heart. This is not an easy exercise for those of us who live mostly in our heads. But it's something that we need to practice so that we become more and more receptive to that presence of Christ, of the light of God within us, guiding us, teaching us, leading us. And I know that several people have come in since we had our pair. So who has come in who doesn't have a partner yet? You partners. Is there anyone else who? So maybe Bob, you could partner with this man. What's your name?
I'm Charles Blue Finier.
Would that be all right? Okay. So here's what we're going to do with our partners. This is an exercise in really paying attention to what we're sensing in our hearts. Remember, Isaac Pennington said it's a sensible plant, or something that senses, something that's sensitive. And we're going to pay attention to what we're sensing in our heart, not our mind. And we're going to take turns. So each person has 5 minutes to speak from the heart. And the other one is going to ask a simple question. And the simple question is, what does your tender heart know right now? Early friends spoke of each other as being tender-hearted. When you're really feeling from the heart, it does feel more tender, and you're a little bit more vulnerable than if you're sort of feeling more in control from your head. What does your tender heart know right now? And the person who is sensing will sense, and if you really sense what is coming from your heart, and it may be hard at first to figure out what is my heart saying as opposed to what's the first thing that comes into my head. Usually your heart doesn't have a lot of words. It might have a few words, but not a lot, and certainly not a whole story. So your answer will be brief. It doesn't have to make sense to your head. Your listener, whatever you say, your listener will say, thank you. And then pause for a moment, and then ask the question again. What does your tender heart know right now? And so again, you go to your heart. What comes to your heart? And then you'll say something, and they'll say thank you, and then pause again, and then ask the question again. So in 5 minutes, the question, depending upon how short your answer is, may be asked many times. And sometimes you may find that answers come from a deeper place as you go on. It's okay if you repeat an answer, but really just seek for what's coming to me right now from the place of my heart. Does anyone have a question about that? As I said, the answers don't have to make sense to your head. Sometimes there's a temptation to start being silly. It's okay if an answer seems silly, but don't sort of divert yourself into just being silly. Just really keep going back to the heart. What is my heart? And sometimes you might find yourself saying something that you didn't know your heart needed. Okay, so after 5 minutes, I'll let you know that it's time to trade. So the listener says thank you. And then just before you switch, just take a few minutes to kind of breathe together and take in what you've shared and what you've heard. And now the second person can ask the question. What does your tender heart know right now? Remembering the short answers are good. So the listener says thank you. Just breathe together for a moment. Now I invite you just to take 2 minutes to tell each other, what was it like to ask the question? What was it like to try to answer the question from your heart?
What was it like? One thing that would be more like it is
It's almost time for a break, but before we take a break, I would just like to hear from a few people. I'm going to pass you the microphone if you'd like to speak. And here's my question. Were you able to experience speaking from a different kind of knowing? And what was that like? Anyone have an answer to that? Were you able to experience a different kind of knowing, a different kind of sensing?
For me, speak up. So for me, it was expressing things that I have been aware of, but they're not things I give great weight or thought to all the time. I tend to give more thought to things of enhancing the control I think I have of my life and my surroundings. So it was a very refreshing translation into another kind of way of thought.
Thank you. Anyone else? Are you able to tap into a different kind of knowing?
By grace, I just fell into this really deep place in a heart space that was very open and spacious and had
Some people can't hear you. I don't know if that's working.
yeah.
Now you can. Okay. I was saying, miraculously or by grace, I sunk into a very deep space, an inner space that was very spacious, and was feeling kind of very slowly in this space a bunch of things that isn't the same as what's up here in the head.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I found this to be a difficult exercise. The main reason was that I really didn't 100% honestly trust my heart. My brain kept getting in the way. And so for me to really shut off my brain, because my training has been in both faiths, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, to be analytical and critical. And so for me to just shut off my brain and let my heart speak, but I was able to do it, though I cannot honestly say I 100% trust it.
Thank you. I think that's true for most of us. We've been trained to live from our brains and not to trust our hearts.
Marcel, I really appreciated the instruction and the permission that you gave to struggle with the process and to have simple answers that may not make sense, because I found the process very helpful, like going a little bit deeper, even though at first it was uncomfortable or unexpected, just working and getting deeper. So, and it helped me to repeat the questions to my partner, and as I felt him opening, that affected my heart, so that when it came time for me to answer the questions, that process continued. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak?
I'll just say that my speaking from the heart was very reassuring to my brain, to essentially just say, don't worry about it. I got this. And so that was nice. And as we all work on our journey, just a feeling that you're getting there. And that was nice.
Anyone else? Anyone else?
Well, I had trouble doing this for the reasons that have been given, and I think where this is really valuable is it makes your brain aware of things that are going on. They're actually going on in your brain, but they're going on in your heart. And it's obviously it took the early Quakers a long time to get to be able to do this successfully. So I think it's very valuable for this to be pointed out to us, this way of dealing with the process.
Thank you.
Hard process.
Thank you. Anyone else? One more person?
I said to my partner something that I've never said to anybody before, but it's been in the back of my subconscious, came out just now. The conviction that tenderness and sympathy is an effort of the will. It's there within us. It has to be cultivated. It has to be consciously tapped. There's a hymn that goes, "Let your heart be broken." Sympathy is an effort of the will, and it's necessary for us to cultivate it.
Thank you. Before we break, I just want to acknowledge that Elaine Emily is here as my elder today from Berkeley Friends Meeting. She's been hosting me, and before that, Strawberry Creek, I'm sorry. So she's been sitting here holding me and this whole gathering in prayer, and she was joined this morning by two other elders. So we have an elders bench, Stephen Matchett and Sally Kingsland. And so you mentioned that there's something going on that helped you get into another space. I think that they're sitting here in prayer may have been some part of that. So thanks to the elders bench. And we'll take 15 minutes for a break and come back at 11:17. 11:07. All right. So I believe there's some refreshments over there. Something.
Yeah, there's food and coffee in the fellowship hall. So let's try and keep ourselves to a quarter of an hour, best we can.